Hello and welcome to day 5 of Arthurian April, and today we are tackling the queen herself, Guinevere. Now, Guinevere is, again, one of the older figures in the Arthurian canon, or the Matter of Britain, which is what I prefer to call it, because canon implies that there's any one story, which is laughable. But she does definitely appear early on in the Welsh triads, and interestingly enough, there's not just one. There are 3 Guineveres. So the name is Guinevere, and the triads actually recount 3 of her right before they mention the other 3 women in Arthur's life, which are his 3 mistresses. Now, this juxtaposition is rather fascinating and just a little bit ironic, since if you know anything about King Arthur, you probably know about the whole love triangle between Arthur, Guinevere, and Lancelot, and how much her infidelity has informed the stories moving on. But of course, that never applied to Arthur, right? Because not only did he have 3 wives, but he had 3 mistresses too, at least. Now, Lancelot doesn't quite appear in the stories for a little while after. It's sort of happening at the same time. We have Chrétien de Troyes writing, we have Marie de France, we have these stories sort of coming together at that period, but already in L'Envol, which is one of the lays of Marie de France, we have Guinevere really portrayed as a very seductive, capricious, and kind of cruel woman. L'Envol falls in love with a fairy queen who may or may not be Morgan Le Fay, and he is tested with his love for her by Guinevere, who tries to basically seduce him away. He rebukes Guinevere. The fairy queen comes and whisks him away to another land of fairy where he's never seen again by other men, and Guinevere is stricken blind because of this terrible thing that she does to try to get L'Envol away. So already we see that she is not necessarily portrayed as a sympathetic character. That doesn't always hold true. Like a lot of the characters who kind of stay with us for about 1,000 years in these myths, she goes back and forth depending on who's telling the tale. And this may have to do with the kinds of audiences that they were being written for, certainly the cultural feeling of the time. Once the Lancelot love triangle really happens, some of the stories, especially earlier on, are much more sympathetic to the lovers, while as later it becomes kind of this awful, sinful, terrible thing. And a lot of that has to do with the religion of the time period and how courtly love was seen depending on what regime was in control. One of the things, though, that almost always figures into her story is the fact that she cannot have children. And for a woman of that time who would have been married to arguably the most powerful person in that area of the world, not being able to have children would have been a pretty disappointing thing. You know, her one job that she was supposed to do was to provide an heir to this incredible throne that had been brought about through all kinds of machinations, as we talked about earlier in the story, between Merlin and Uther and Igraine and poor Gorlois and everything that happened in Tintagel and Cornwall. And the fact that she can't do this, I think psychologically is really interesting. Not that I want to reduce her to that being the most important thing. I think as a feminist myself, it is an uncomfortable place to think about. But I think from a character perspective, if you know that you're not able to have children, having an affair is not as scary as it might be for a woman who, for that, would be a certain challenge. Sometimes she's viewed as a very strong and intelligent person. In quite a few of the stories, Arthur has to go elsewhere to fight various battles, and she's put in control as regent. But then other times she ends up kind of hooking up with Mordred, who, if you're familiar, Mordred is the son of Arthur and his half-sister Morgan. And in some of those stories, Guinevere and Mordred go on to have children together, which, if you think that your family tree is complicated, don't ever try to make the Arthurian family tree make sense, because it doesn't. There's also a lot of tension, especially in Mallory, between the Orkneys, so that's Gawain and his brothers Gareth, Gaheris, and sometimes Agravain, and Guinevere. So they definitely have it out for her by the time you get to Mallory, and they're part of the crew that discovers her in bed with Lancelot. Now, Mallory definitely points a finger at Guinevere and Lancelot at that point and says that by the time this happens, they've been just kind of blatantly flaunting their relationship in front of people, and they're kind of due this discovering, but it is pretty horrible what happens. There's a lot of abducting, people go back and forth, and essentially everything ends up falling apart because Lancelot, the best knight that Arthur's ever had, and his most trusted person in the whole world, is sleeping with his wife. I've always felt like there was a little bit more to that story, but in my own take, I changed it quite a bit because I decided that I loved this idea of the three wives of Arthur so much from so early on in the tales that my Arthur would indeed marry three different women named, at least in part, Guinevere, because their names all derive from the name Guinevere. So there is Guinevere, then there's Huifar, and then there's Maura, and they all come from different versions of the name over time. They're three sisters. They are all daughters of Leodegrance, who is king of Avilion or Avalon, depending on how you tell that story. But I like to add a little bit more complication and be able to give a little bit of a nod to the Welsh triads. If you've ever seen the movie Camelot or the play, the musical, that does a pretty great job of sort of the traditional kind of story between Lancelot and Guinevere, who kind of seem absolutely helpless to fall in love with each other and so surprised. But in that version, you know, she's also kind of in love with Arthur. It's not like he's a bad husband. He's a really good man. And she is definitely in agony over trying to figure out how to make this work and how to live with herself. It's a lot darker in a lot of the other stories, but I think the tension that Guinevere has between wanting to be a good wife, to provide an heir, and to follow her heart and try to live a little bit is also quite meaningful. And like most troublesome women, very often they threaten to burn her, call her a witch, try her for sorcery. The more that changes, the more things stay the same. What can I say? Anyway, that's a little bit about Guinevere. Fun fact, William Morris, the William Morris, who was the pre-Raphaelite painter, tile maker, furniture maker, also wrote a wonderful poem called In Defense of Guinevere, which happened to be one of the subjects of my master's thesis. And it's a very interesting little take on her, very much of the time of the late Victorian period. So tune in tomorrow for more.